Okay, I think we'll get going. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Clean Arctic Alliance's pre-PPR 12 briefing. PPR is the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee of the IMO. First of all, we have a couple of housekeeping matters. I'd like you to just note that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available after today. And then secondly, if you have any questions, could you please try and indicate to which speaker the question is directed and submit it via the Q&A option, which should be near the bottom of your screen. The intention is to take all of the questions during a Q&A session at the end once both speakers have spoken. We will endeavour to answer all of the questions during the Q&A at the end of the webinar, but if time runs out, we will aim to follow up if we can with a response after the event. I'm just going to say a few words in terms of preparation and setting the scene, and then I'll introduce our speakers. Today's briefing aims to provide some insights on the agenda of the 12th session of the International Maritime Organization's Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee on the likely discussions and possible outcomes of importance to ship operations in the Arctic, and in particular on efforts to reduce black carbon emissions and to address discharges from exhaust gas cleaning systems or scrubbers. Last year, during the Clean Arctic Alliance's pre-PPR 11 briefing, I drew attention to what was then a recent EU Copernicus announcement that global temperatures had been 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer over the previous 12 months. This did not mean that we had as yet exceeded 1.5 degrees global warming, but that we were dangerously close to doing so. And a year on, it seems that little has changed. NASA and NOAA have both recognized that 2024 was the warmest year since record keeping began in 1880. And it is the 11th successive year in which a new heat record has been set. Global warming is continuing to contribute to extreme weather events, including larger and more intense wildfires, devastating floods, tropical storms, and deadly heat waves. Some of these extreme weather events readily make the news headlines, but what isn't so obvious is that these events are happening around the whole world and throughout the whole year. A recently published annual review of global climate extremes by the Chinese Academy of Sciences Institute of Atmospheric Physics identified that in 2024, southern China experienced its second rainiest spring in 60 years, with some regions receiving double the normal rainfall. The United Arab Emirates witnessed a historical deluge when Dubai recorded more rainfall in 24 hours than was typically seen in 75 years. Central Asia faced the worst flooding in 7 decades, and in Spain, one region received over 77 centimetres of rain in under 24 hours. There was extreme rainfall and flooding recorded from southern Brazil, Central Europe, the Sahel in Africa, Eastern Africa, Southwestern Asia, Southwest Russia, Kazakhstan, Nepal, and more. And it isn't all about rainfall and flooding. 2024 also saw devastating tropical storms. Hurricane Helen in the United States was the deadliest hurricane in nearly 20 years, while Hurricane Milton was the most intense Atlantic hurricane since 1851. In the Western North Pacific, 4 concurrent tropical cyclones were recorded in November 2024 for the first time on record. And there were droughts. Southern Africa experienced the worst drought in decades, affecting over 27 million people. In Sicily and Sardinia, agricultural yields plummeted by up to 70%. And drought was recorded from other regions too. And between early 2023 and the summer of 2024, the Panama Canal experienced drought, along with historically low water levels, which disrupted global shipping and caused losses estimated at $700 million. The last example brings home the relevance of these events to the work of the International Maritime Organization. In relation to shipping in the Arctic, it must be recognised that the Arctic is now considered to be warming 4 times faster than the world as a whole, and is already at 2.5 degrees warmer when compared with pre-industrial levels. It is also acidifying faster than the global ocean. Scientists believe that the Arctic's thresholds of no return are likely to be reached, and possibly quite soon. And we are already seeing unprecedented changes. Arctic sea ice loss, Greenland ice sheet melting, permafrost thaw, increasing ocean temperature, and acidification are occurring at alarming rates. Declines in sea ice extent and thickness are leading to a social and environmental crisis in the Arctic. And there is high confidence that increased weather and climate extreme events are exposing Arctic communities to acute food insecurity. International shipping is just one of a number of sectors that are contributing to both global and Arctic heating through emissions of greenhouse gases, both globally and of short-lived climate forces such as black carbon. Black carbon has been identified as an unusually potent short-lived climate forcer in the cryosphere regions, including the Arctic. And the IPCC's sixth assessment report has doubled the estimate of warming potential of black carbon on snow and ice, following recent improvements in the understanding of black carbon's warming on snow forcing. And it is now estimated to be 2 to 4 times that of the equivalent CO2 forcing. And what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. Changes in the Arctic are impacting not only the Arctic, but also the global climate and ocean circulation. These processes, sea ice freeze and thaw, ice sheet melting, permafrost thaw, are nearing points beyond which rapid and irreversible changes on the scale of multiple generations are possible. Arctic sea ice has undergone a dramatic transformation over the last 4 decades and is rapidly heading towards an eventual ice-free Arctic Ocean. A newly published study estimated that the first ice-free period might even occur prior to 2030, given the warming to date. Ice-free periods during the summer months are going to increase and potentially become normal should global temperatures exceed around 1.7 degrees C. And this could have knock-on effects on increased permafrost thaw, which will then contribute increased levels of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere and increased melt of the Greenland ice sheet. This in turn contributing to sea level rises and the slowing down of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, or AMOC. In recent months, serious concerns and warnings have been expressed by scientists globally about the abrupt shutdown of the AMOC, amid signs that it has slowed over the past decades. Shutdown of the AMOC will result in very dramatic changes in both the climate and in food production across Scandinavia and Europe, and will accelerate sea level rise around North America and raise the frequency of extreme weather events. This is a knock-on effect of both the melt of the Greenland ice sheet and the sea ice loss. It has long been recognised that the best and least costly opportunity to avert runaway global heating while respecting the human right to health is to act immediately to reduce emissions of short-lived climate pollutants, those pollutants that have an immediate impact, and stopping emitting them will see immediate results. The United Nations Environment Programme recognises that fast action to reduce short-lived climate pollutants could help avoid over half a degree Celsius of warming by 2050. We're now going to hear from 2 speakers who will tell us more about the items on the agenda of PPR 12 that could contribute to action to reduce the impact of shipping on the Arctic, and in doing so, slow down the impact of the Arctic on global climate. Our first speaker will be Bill Hemmings, Technical Advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, who will address efforts to reduce the impact of black carbon emissions from ships impacting the Arctic. Bill will be followed by Eelco Leemans, Technical Advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, who will address the use of exhaust gas cleaning systems or scrubbers and the discharge of scrubber wastes. After the 2 speakers, there should be plenty of time for some questions and discussion. So, first of all, I'll just hand over to Bill. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everybody. The impact of ship black carbon on the Arctic is an important piece of unfinished business related to climate change and international shipping's growing presence there that's been on the IMO agenda for 14 years. 14 years. The Arctic's the canary in the mine as to global climate breakdown, and discussions come in the wake of a swirl of statements focused on the security and geopolitics of this most sensitive of climate regions. Therefore, I'd say it's fair game to shine a light on what happens or not next week. Are IMO member states up to the task? Change the slide, please. The issue, unresolved since 2011, is, should the IMO take mandatory action and impose requirements on ships to cut their black carbon emissions in and near the Arctic? Several IMO resolutions have proposed voluntary measures, such as optimizing engines and operating conditions and the individual ship monitoring of Arctic BC emissions. These are important, as is IMO Resolution 34277, agreed in 2021 on switching to distillate fuels. But all these calls are for voluntary action. The question is voluntary action enough, particularly as Arctic ship BC emissions have more than doubled since 2011? They show no signs of abating and are unlikely to decrease if, as the media hypes it, the Arctic is a last frontier ripe to be explored and developed. The IMO, International Maritime Organization, is committed to take global regulatory action to cut ship CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions at MEPC 83 this coming April in London. Black carbon is several thousand times a more potent climate forcer than CO2 in the short term, and even more so when deposited directly on ice and snow, as is the case with ships when they're operating in the Arctic. So surely the fact that BC isn't a greenhouse gas shouldn't be an obstacle to taking similar regulatory action. As Sean has just stressed, the Arctic is facing catastrophic climate breakdown and multiple tipping points having potentially severe global consequences. Change the slide, please. Residual fuels can be replaced with distillates, which will cut BC emissions and their climate warming impacts. That's not just me talking, but people in the marine fuel industry as well, and others. These are essentially the same distillates that thousands of ships switch to every day when entering emission coral areas, ECAs, under MARPOL. The additional fuel cost has been fully built in and accepted by the shipping industry and customers alike for years now. Distillate fuel is readily available everywhere and already in use mainly by smaller vessels in the Arctic. It's the larger ships, including oil and chemical tankers, bulk carriers and general cargo vessels, etc., often under the control and ownership of international operators, which now need to implement the fuel switch. Arctic residual fuel burn volumes that would need to be switched in the Arctic are a small fraction of the fuel volumes to be switched when the Mediterranean ECA takes effect in May this year. Change the slide, please. The ISO, in their submission PPR 1261, proposes 4 fuel quality criteria that would need to characterize Arctic distillate fuels for lower BC emissions there compared to residual fuels. The 4 criteria are important also because there are some smaller volume distillate type fuels that contain residual microcarbon residues or other fuel properties that wouldn't do the job. These 4 fuel quality criteria for what we dub as BC Arctic polar fuels feature in the latest 2024 edition of the ISO Marine Fuel Specifications ISO 8217. Ships intending to sail into Arctic waters can easily order these fuels. But to get to that point, and if the intention is to make the switch to distillate mandatory, then an appropriate definition of BC polar fuels needs to be debated in the PPR 12 working group. It's too detailed an issue only for plenary. IMO members will need to speak up in plenary and ensure that the issue goes to the working group, and then participate actively there. And if agreement is reached, then hopefully the wheels will be set in motion for some member states to make a proposal to MEPC to mandate it. The amendment would be to MARPOL Annex 6, which deals with air pollution, including fuel sulfur content. Annex 6 is the agenda item that the Arctic ship BC issue has been listed under since 2011. Other marine fuels in use today will also cut black carbon compared to residual use, including fuels being developed and produced to reduce greenhouse gases and CO2, for example, e-fuels. So PPR 12 needs to discuss how any wording to define Arctic BC polar fuels can embrace all these other fuels, whose specific black carbon cutting characteristics will at some stage need to be analysed and quantified. That might involve multiple fuel tests and can't be done overnight. Change the slide, please. So, there is indeed another Arctic ship issue to be considered at PPR 12. It concerns oil spills. Norway has proposed a mandatory measure concerning Arctic high pour point ship fuels, which would effectively require residual fuels to be replaced by distillates up there. Pour point, technical point, is the lowest temperature at which a petroleum product, such as a fuel or lubricant, will flow under specific conditions. Residual fuels, heavy fuel oil, and especially very low sulfur fuel oil, VLSFO, and ultra low sulfur fuel oil, ULSFO, developed to meet low sulfur IMO regulations, have proven to have pour points well above 0 degrees Celsius and even up to 30 degrees Celsius. High pour point fuels clump when spilled in cold water and have proven to be almost impossible to clean up. It so happens that over 99% of all distillate fuels, including the proposed DMA BC polar fuels, have pour points of 0 degrees Celsius or less, which is the maximum acceptable pour point that Norway proposes for Arctic marine fuels. Norway's proposed definition of distillate pour point polar fuels is slightly different to that proposed for BC DMA polar fuels. Norway calls for mandatory action on Arctic pour point fuels by amending MARPOL Annex 1, which covers oil spills. Change the slide, please. There's a bit more. There's also the question of geographic scope. Norway's pour point proposal covers the polar code Arctic, as does the IMO's Arctic HFO ban, which took effect in July 24. You could see the different lines there showing the delineation. The HFO ban, which took effect last July, should already have eliminated all residual fuel use in the Polar Code Arctic there and then. But it didn't, because the ban itself is full of loopholes. Moreover, this Polar Code area excludes vast parts of the Arctic around Iceland and off the Norwegian coast, you can see that, where ship activity and BC emissions are clearly very high. To be climate effective, any Arctic BC polar fuels regulation would need to cover these sea areas as well. And I would reckon the sea is just as cold there, so any spill of high pour point fuels in this wider and just as remote part of the Arctic would be equally catastrophic. Analysis also shows that as much as 70+%, that's 70+% of large ships over 5,000 gross tons operating in Arctic seas on the Atlantic side are engaged in trade with the European Union. They will have called at a European Union port or EEA port as part of the same Arctic voyage, and so are already regulated by the EU's Green Climate Deal, but unfortunately not yet for BC emissions. Moreover, a high proportion of these EU MRV ships will be required to have switched fuels on the same Arctic voyage when transiting up and down into European ECAs en route. Change the slide, please. So resolving all these issues is now the challenge for the IMO. And there, the Arctic Circle from WWF has set out some articles. Its member states, along with the international shipping industry, the oil industry, and indeed the European Union, which have to act. Let's hope that after all these years, the IMO meeting next week makes good progress towards real action. Change the slide, please. Thank you, everyone. I'll now hand over to Eelco Leemans to talk about scrubbers.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Well, my presentation aligns quite well with what you have to say. So my name is Eelco Leemans. I'm a former mariner and I have operated on ships in the Arctic, among others in Svalbard. So I have an idea what it's about. And since many years, I've been involved with campaigns to clean up international shipping. One of the things was the revision process of MARPOL Annex 6. And during that process, there were suggestions to switch completely to distillates. And that idea was not just from the environmental NGOs, but also from an international maritime trade organization called Intertanko, who were really favoring a complete switch to distillate to avoid any sort of market distortions. Well, that didn't happen. And next slide, please. So what MARPOL Annex 6 said is that one of the things is there's a certain limit to the emissions of sulfur emissions, and that can be done in two ways. Either using cleaner fuels with very low sulfur contents, or use high sulfur fuel, such as the heavy fuel oil that is used by many ships, and then abate the emissions by using scrubbers. So, and a scrubber is a piece of equipment that's installed in the exhaust gas chimney of the ship, and by using a mist of seawater takes out all the contaminants from the smoke, and not just the sulfur, but also all kinds of other substances that are created by the combustion in the engine. So the contents could be PAHs, but also several types of metals, including heavy metals, strong acids, etc. So what happens with this concoction of the seawater with this material, that is mostly directly pumped overboard in the marine environment, or in the aquatic environment, could also be freshwater when it's in a port area. So you can imagine what kind of consequences that will have. Next slide, please. Interestingly, there's a big project that has been running for 4 years. It's called Emerge. It's an international project with many scientific institutions, research institutions, universities, etc., and that have produced more than 40 scientific studies on the impacts of ship pollution, among others from scrubbers. So you will find the link here, and some of the studies that have been done in this project clearly show that there's a devastating impact on, for instance, zooplankton, or on larvae of bivalves, of shellfish. So you can imagine that those types of organisms are at the base of the food web. So you can imagine what the results will be for higher organisms. You can find all the information on that website, and I can really recommend you, if you are looking for background information, to have a look at that. Next slide, please. So next week is the IMO subcommittee PPR 12. PPR stands for Pollution Prevention and Response. And that subcommittee is responsible for a lot of these issues that we are dealing with. Now, on this agenda, there are 9 documents on scrubbers by member states and industry groups. And then there are also 3 documents by a group of environmental NGOs that were earlier submitted to the MEPC 82 and MEPC 81 meeting. And in those documents, you will also find what the environmental NGOs are asking for. Now, the previous PPR subcommittee meeting, PPR 11, invited member states and international organizations to submit further proposals to PPR 12 on the identification and development of regulatory measures and instruments on the discharge of discharge water from the EGCS. EGCS, by the way, is exhaust gas cleaning systems or scrubbers. That's what we usually call them. So next slide, please. So the Clean Arctic Alliance, well, it's a pity that back then, during the revision of MARPOL Annex 6, that we didn't manage to get a complete switch to distillates, because that would really help a lot of the issues we're dealing with, like what Bill just said about black carbon, about the issue of the danger of spills, oil spills in the Arctic. So the Clean Arctic Alliance next week will call for the following: to consider whether the use of scrubbers is aligned with requirements outlined in Regulation 4 of MARPOL Annex 6, and also to amend MARPOL Annex 6 to explicitly prohibit the use of scrubbers as a means of alternative compliance instead of switching to distillates, because we also feel that it is inconsistent with obligations of IMO member states under international treaties. Think about, for instance, the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. There's several paragraphs in UNCLOS that seem to be inconsistent with MARPOL Annex 6. So in all, it would be much better to always switch to distillate fuel. Next slide, please. And until such a global ban is introduced and ships really switch to cleaner fuel, like distillates, to encourage a scrubber waste discharge ban in jurisdictional waters. So jurisdictional waters, that is, for instance, the territorial seas of coastal states, inland waters, etc. And also to stop approving scrubbers as an alternative compliance mechanism. And further, to also adopt a resolution on shipping operators to immediately stop the release of scrubber discharges waste in areas identified for their sensitivity, vulnerability, or conservation value. That is in particular the Arctic, of course. Well, a resolution is not a mandatory piece of mechanism. It's just a voluntary way to deal with this. And so we do hope that member states will support us in our calling for that resolution. Next slide, please. Well, thank you. And I would like to say, well, if there are any questions, please go to the chat function. And I've put also some links here. One is a blog that I wrote for the Clean Arctic Alliance. You can find that on the webpage. And the other one is a link to the very fresh magazine of WWF, which has a lot of articles on shipping, among others, an article I wrote about scrubbers. And there's also an article by Bill Hemmings on black carbon. So with that, over to you again, Sian.
Thank you, and thank you both to Bill and to Eelco. We've got around 15 minutes now before we need to wrap up, so we've got time for a few questions. I can see there's one already in the Q&A box, which we'll come to in just a second, but can I please, as Eelco's just done, encourage everyone, if you've got any questions, even if you don't know who they're aimed at, please put them into the Q&A function and we'll try and address them. The first question, though, Eelco, is to you from Bridget Barons. And Bridget is asking, did she understand you correctly that Intertanko suggested to use distillates in the Arctic? And where can that information be found?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I was among the group, a group of scientific experts that was advising the IMO on this matter, and there was a representative from Intertanko there as well, and who clearly argued that it would be good to switch to distillates. But that is an oral recollection, I would have to find that back, and I'm not sure where exactly you could find that. The person who told this during our deliberations is called Dragos Rauta. Perhaps you know him, and he's often at the IMO delegations. I hope that helps.
Thank you. And I know there was a paper submitted, I'd have to dig back for it, but there was an industry paper submitted probably 3 or 4 years ago now, also that mentions switch to distillates as one of the ways in which black carbon emissions could be rapidly reduced as well. It wasn't the only way, but it did identify by switching to distillates as a fast way of reducing black carbon emissions. We can dig that out. There's another question aimed at Eelco. Is there any estimate of how many ships are using scrubbers in the Arctic? Can they just be switched off, or do they have to be physically removed? And also, is there any estimate of the cost of switching from scrubbers to cleaner fuel? This is from Daniel Creasy at Dialogue Earth.
It's a good question. One of the researchers in the Emerge project was about the cost of scrubbers and about the time that shipping companies would earn it back. And that turned out to be about 4 to 5 years. So that would mean that a ship owner that has invested in a scrubber after 4 or 5 years would have earned it back. So then there would be no additional costs. But I'm not really sure how many ships are using scrubbers in the Arctic. There's an estimate that worldwide there are now 5,000 ships operating with scrubbers, or that have scrubbers installed, and that number is still growing. But I couldn't answer that straight away.
Thank you, Eelco. Yes, I mean, we certainly know of scrubbers being used by some ships in the North Atlantic part of the Arctic, but I must admit, I agree, I've not seen figures for the whole of the Arctic, something that could be looked into. Bill, I come to you. If there is just one progressive step that could be made next week, what would you like it to be?
Take the advice of people who know all about marine fuels, and they've said these are the specs which, if ships use them instead of residual fuels, there'll certainly be significant black carbon emission reductions if they're using them in the Arctic. Yeah, there'll be variations according to the ship type of engine, what the conditions are like. But given all of that, and given that we all know that if the engines are maintained well versus not maintained well, and depending on the loads, given all those issues, if you use a cleaner fuel, it shouldn't be a miracle to conclude that what comes out at the top in exhaust is going to be cleaner. So let's take the advice of the people who produce this stuff and who know all about it, and they've proposed to the IMO next week, these are the criteria, and if we apply them, and we can certainly specify what those criteria would mean in terms of a fuel spec. And so any ship going up into the Arctic, easy peasy, just order these fuels, continue to maintain the engines as well as you can, and sure, measure your emissions and see what you can improve progressively. But just in other forms of of transport fuel, whether it's road, rail, off-road, aviation, it ain't any myth or secret that cleaner fuels will lead to less pollution. That's my answer.
Thank you, Bill. Can I just encourage anyone who's got any questions to submit them in the Q&A? We've answered the 2 that have come in so far. If there are any others, please get them in. And while that happens, hopefully, Eelco, I just put the same question to you. What is the one progressive step you would like to see happen next week?
We would like IMO to adopt that resolution, calling shipping companies and member states to have restrictions in their territorial seas and in sensitive waters, in particular in the Arctic. Now there's a lot of discussion on this, and sometimes ship owners also say, well, you know, this is all according to the rules and the regulations, but like there's one delegation that also submitted a document that says this, but then I say, well, if it's according to the regulations, that does not mean that it's not harmful. And in general, the shipping industry is still far away from being really clean and really sustainable. So there's still a lot of work to do. One of them is to get rid of scrubbers and just switch to distillate fuel, which can be done by any ship.
Thank you. Thank you, Raya. We've got another question here. Who is the most influential opponent of progressive measures regarding black carbon and scrubber use in the Arctic? So I'll let you each take a turn at that. Bill, are you comfortable to go first?
Well, you know, I've worked in industry before, and it's no secret to anybody that money counts. And if you can keep your operating costs as low as possible, that's good for any business. But I mean, the reality is, for the health of the world, for the health of people living around coastal regions, etc., the global community and the IMO have agreed that ships have to clean up their sulfur emissions because sulfur kills. Yeah. And you can do that by moving to a distillate fuel. Yeah. And so that's the answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. Eelco?
Yeah, when it comes to scrubbers, obviously it's mostly the shipping industry. And the representative shipping industry, well, there's a couple of delegations like the ICS, BIMCO, CLIA. CLIA is the cruise ship industry that operate a lot with scrubbers that are really opposing this. But what you also see is that some national delegations, some country delegations, also invite industry people in their delegation, and then sometimes it's difficult to make the distinction between who is industry, who is really representing a national government. So, but the industry delegations are the most influential opponents, I would say.
Could I just add that, you know, some of the industry representatives have said, oh, look, you know, we don't do anything. We shouldn't do anything on a regulatory nature unless we've got absolute proof. And so really we need a few years. Let's go and test all these fuels and see whether cleaner fuels really are clean and whether they really reduce this sorts of pollution. I mean, the reality is that over 20 years ago, North America and Europe and now other countries said, without a doubt, road fuel fumes kill. So we're going to clean up road fuel, and then we're going to clean up other forms of transport fuel. The idea of now, after 14 years of discussions at the IMO, while the Arctic is crumbling in terms of climate change, that we're going to now spend 3 or 4 years measuring to see whether clean fuels actually are clean. I don't think I need to say anything more about that.
We've got 2 more questions, and then I think we need to start wrapping up. So, 3 more questions. We'll try and answer these quickly. Anne Garland has asked, how does Russia shipping companies abide by IMO and reduction of black carbon and scrubbers? I'm happy to say a few words, or would one of you like to jump in first?
No, please, Sian, go ahead.
I mean, obviously, it's very challenging at the moment with the geopolitical situation, but I think the IMO does a good job of agreeing global regulation and everybody generally being committed to following those global regulations. I think there are two factors here, though, that are relevant. One is that, yes, Russian companies will probably abide by Russian law first, but equally, they're not just, well, it depends on the company, but they're not all just working or operating in Russian waters. So if they're operating in other international waters or other waters of other countries, then obviously they need to abide by the IMO regulations as well. And equally, the other way around, it's not just Russian flagged ships that are operating in Russian waters. There are flags from other parts of the world as well. So they equally have to abide by the international regulations. So yes, I think we're in challenging times at the moment, but there's still a lot of following the rules and a lot that can be done. Time's running on, and I've got a few words to just say at the end. So I'm going to just quickly move to the last two questions here. The first one is for you, Eelco. Is the cost the greatest barrier to stopping the use of scrubbers in the, in fact, they're both for you. So is the cost the greatest barrier to stopping the use of scrubbers in the Arctic? And are closed loop scrubbers considered a serious alternative to cleaner fuels? Maybe you could tackle them both together.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Of course, cost is a barrier, because if a ship has installed a scrubber, they've invested that, and then they are using the cheaper heavy fuel oil. So of course, cost is a barrier, but that is always the case with new developments in the shipping industry. I mean, I remember that a long time ago, a certain type of anti-fouling could not be used anymore, and then the whole shipping industry was saying, "Well, then it's over for us. We can't. Then we will use so much energy and fuel." And in the end, when that regulation is done, then you won't hear them anymore. So it's just, you just have to get over it. You have to get over it and just realize that we still have a lot to do. So one thing is good is that there's an HFO ban in the Arctic. Well, not in the entire Arctic, but that will also help with stopping scrubbers. The other one is about closed loop scrubbers. That's an interesting question. Well, what happens with closed loop scrubbers is that they're often also discharging the scrubber water somewhere else. And in many times, the concentration of the wastewater is much higher. So the concentration of hazardous materials is much higher. So this is not seen as a serious alternative. We should just switch to distillate fuel, or in the end to much more cleaner fuel, and for instance use wind assisted propulsion again.
Okay, so very quickly, of course, cost is a barrier, but the vast majority of all transport fuels used around the world, oil fuels, are much cleaner than the dirty fuel which the shipping industry used. Given that, the greatest barrier now is that the United Nations and its member states, and particularly the EU, which dominates the large shipping traffic into the Arctic, needs to act.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We will wrap up in a few minutes, but just very quickly, I want to recognise that as well as addressing black carbon emissions and discharges from scrubbers, there are other important environmental issues on the agenda next week too. In particular, consideration of performance testing and indicative monitoring requirements for existing sewage treatment plants on ships, essential in order to be confident of the proper functioning of sewage treatment plants and to not circumvent accountability. And also the consideration of progress of the delivery of the IMO's Marine Plastic Litter Action Plan, which was due to be achieved by 2025 in line with the timeframes established by the UN in Sustainable Development Goal 14, but where it appears that there's been a lack of momentum and ambition since it was adopted. So it's clear that further effort is needed to enforce the requirements for garbage to be delivered and disposed of in waste reception facilities, and for more public awareness, education and seafarer training to address the ongoing and likely increasing amounts of illegal discharge of plastic litter into the ocean. So it's anticipated that there will be working groups on these issues too, and hopefully progress. So I'm just going to finish today just by a quick quick summary. With the Arctic climate crisis rapidly approaching, the point where changes such as the loss of sea ice, melting of the Greenland ice sheet, the slowing down of ocean circulation patterns all becoming self-sustaining, it really is a travesty that emissions of a very potent short-lived climate pollutant and ongoing ocean pollution are being allowed to increase in the region where they are having some of the greatest impacts. Action to reduce black carbon emissions from ships operating in and near to the Arctic isn't difficult. It doesn't require the development of new fuels or new technologies, and it can be done with immediate effect. Ultimately, however, I do feel that we need regulation. Not only should regulation require the use of cleaner fuels in the Arctic and immediately stop the release of scrubber discharge wastes into coastal and protected and sensitive areas, but it would also help to maintain a common standard for all ships to operate to. A mandatory regulation addressing black carbon could be developed for introduction in MARPOL Annex 6, which regulates air emissions, and a resolution calling on shipping operators to prevent ocean pollution and immediately stop the release of scrubber discharges into protected areas, endangered wildlife habitats and other ecologically sensitive areas is essential. So finally, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank once again our speakers today, Bill and Eelco. So thank you both. And I would also just like to thank all of the participants for joining us today too, and also for providing questions and contributing to the discussion. As I said at the beginning, it's our intention to make the recording of the webinar available on our website, and details will be circulated to all participants, so you can come back and review it if you want to. And in the meantime, I hope that you found today's discussion useful, and I hope that PPR 12 is a landmark meeting and makes significant progress on these important issues. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.